The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the old city. Princess Eleanor walked quietly through the market square, her simple cloak hiding her royal identity. She wanted to see how ordinary people lived, to understand their struggles and joys without the barrier of her title. The princess stopped at a small bakery, the smell of fresh bread drawing her in. Behind the counter stood a woman named Margaret, tired lines etched deep into her face. Margaret had been working since dawn, her hands covered in flour, her back aching from years of bending over hot ovens. Eleanor smiled warmly at the baker. She asked for 2 loaves of bread, speaking softly and politely. Margaret looked at her with suspicious eyes. The woman saw only another customer, perhaps someone from a slightly better part of town based on the quality of her cloak. Margaret wrapped the bread roughly, her movements sharp and impatient. When Eleanor reached for her coin purse, it slipped from her fingers and scattered coins across the wooden floor. The princess bent down quickly to gather them, apologizing for the trouble. This simple act seemed to anger Margaret further. She had been having a terrible morning already. Her husband had left her 3 years ago, taking all their savings. Her daughter was sick at home, needing medicine she could barely afford. The rent was overdue and the landlord had threatened to throw them out by the end of the week. Eleanor stood up, coins in hand, still smiling despite the woman's cold demeanor. She tried to make friendly conversation, asking about the bread recipe and complimenting the bakery's warm atmosphere. Margaret's patience snapped like a dry twig. The baker's voice grew loud and harsh. She told Eleanor that rich people like her had no idea what real life was like. Margaret said that women who wore fine cloaks and had time to wander markets had never known true hunger or desperation. Her words became crueler, more personal. Eleanor's smile faded, but she remained calm. She tried to explain that she was not there to cause trouble, only to buy bread and perhaps share a kind word. Margaret would not listen. Her anger, built up over years of hardship, poured out like water from a broken dam. Outside the bakery, a royal guard named Thomas had been watching. He was assigned to protect the princess during her walks through the city, always staying at a careful distance to allow her the freedom she craved. Thomas was a veteran soldier, his face scarred from battles, his uniform bearing medals from years of service. Thomas heard Margaret's voice rising, heard the insults being thrown at the princess. His hand moved instinctively to his sword. Every fiber of his being demanded he rush in and arrest this woman for speaking to royalty with such disrespect. The punishment for insulting a member of the royal family was severe, possibly even imprisonment. But Thomas held his position. He had served Princess Eleanor for 5 years now. He knew her character, understood her heart. She had asked him many times to let her experience life as others did, to not interfere unless her safety was truly threatened. Words, she had told him, were not weapons that could truly harm her. Inside the bakery, Margaret continued her tirade. She spoke about how the royal family lived in luxury while common people starved. She said that princesses played at being kind while knowing nothing of real suffering. She accused Eleanor of being naive and foolish, wasting her time pretending to care about ordinary citizens. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not from anger, but from sadness. She realized that this woman's pain ran deep, that years of hardship had hardened her heart. The princess understood that Margaret was not really angry at her personally, but at a world that seemed unfair and cruel. The other customers in the bakery had fallen silent. They watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, some embarrassed by Margaret's behavior, others secretly agreeing with her bitter words. A young boy tugged at his mother's skirt, confused by why the nice lady was being yelled at. Eleanor placed the coins on the counter carefully. She picked up the wrapped loaves of bread and held them close to her chest. Before leaving, she looked directly into Margaret's angry eyes and spoke words that would later echo through the city. She thanked Margaret for her honesty. Eleanor said that hearing such truth, even when painful, was valuable. She admitted that she could never fully understand what Margaret had endured, but she wanted to learn. The princess promised that she would not forget this encounter or the lessons it taught her. Margaret stood frozen behind her counter, slightly taken aback by this response. She had expected defensiveness, anger, or superiority. Instead, she received humility and genuine emotion. For a brief moment, her hard expression softened, confusion replacing rage. Eleanor turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were steady despite her trembling hands. The princess held her head high, not with pride but with quiet dignity. She had come to learn about her people, and she had learned more than she expected. Thomas watched from his position across the street as Eleanor emerged from the bakery. He saw the tears on her cheeks, noticed how tightly she clutched the bread. His jaw clenched. Every instinct still screamed at him to go arrest that baker woman, to make her pay for causing his princess such distress. But something stopped him. Thomas had been a soldier all his life. He had followed orders without question, had enforced laws with an iron hand. Yet in this moment, watching Eleanor's brave, tearful face, he felt something shift inside him. He realized that true strength was not about crushing those who spoke harshly, but about choosing mercy even when you had the power to punish. Eleanor walked slowly through the market square, her mind replaying Margaret's words. She thought about her palace, her comfortable life, her full stomach and warm bed. She thought about all the Margarets in her kingdom, struggling every day just to survive. The weight of her responsibility felt heavier than ever before. Thomas followed at his usual distance, his hand now resting calmly at his side, away from his weapon. He made a decision in that moment that would change everything. He would not report this incident. He would not have Margaret arrested or punished. Instead, he would speak with the princess about what he had witnessed and what it meant. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The market square continued its daily rhythm of buying and selling, of conversations and laughter. But for three people, everything had changed. A princess had been humbled, a guard had been challenged, and a bitter baker had met someone who refused to respond to hatred with more hatred. Margaret stood alone in her bakery, staring at the coins Eleanor had left. They were more than enough for the bread, far more than necessary. The woman's hands shook as she counted them. There was enough here to buy medicine for her daughter, maybe even make a payment on the overdue rent. Confusion and shame began to replace Margaret's anger. She replayed her own harsh words in her mind. She thought about the young woman's tearful but kind response. Margaret slumped against her counter, suddenly exhausted, feeling the weight of her own bitterness for the first time in years. The day continued, but nothing would be the same for any of them. This brief encounter in a simple bakery had set into motion events that would ripple far beyond what anyone could imagine. Thomas followed Princess Eleanor through the winding streets, maintaining the professional distance his duty required. But his mind was anything but calm. He had been a royal guard for 15 years, serving under 3 different members of the royal family. Never had he witnessed such disrespect go unpunished. The princess walked slowly, occasionally stopping to wipe her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Thomas noticed everything. He saw how she clutched that bread as if it were precious treasure. He observed how she glanced back toward the bakery twice, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. They reached the quieter streets near the palace gardens. Eleanor finally turned to acknowledge Thomas, knowing he had been there all along. She did not look upset with him for not intervening. Instead, she offered him a small, sad smile that made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. Thomas approached and bowed respectfully. He asked if the princess was well, if she needed anything. His voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Eleanor thanked him for his discretion, for allowing her to handle the situation as she saw fit. She told him she wanted to return to the palace to think. As they walked together toward the palace gates, Thomas struggled with his conscience. The law was clear. Anyone who insulted royalty faced serious consequences. He had sworn an oath to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but their honor and dignity as well. By not reporting the incident, he was technically breaking that oath. Yet something about the whole encounter felt different. Thomas had arrested people before for far lesser offenses. He had seen men imprisoned for merely raising their voices near royal processions. He had watched families destroyed because someone spoke carelessly about the king or queen. And for what? To maintain an image of untouchable power? Eleanor dismissed him at the palace entrance, saying she needed time alone. Thomas bowed again and went to the guards' quarters. His fellow soldiers were playing cards, laughing about something that had happened during the morning patrol. He could not bring himself to join them. Instead, he sat on his bunk, his mind replaying the scene at the bakery. That evening, Thomas could not sleep. He kept seeing the baker woman's face twisted with anger and pain. He remembered her words about rich people not understanding real suffering. He thought about his own family, his younger sister who had died from fever because they could not afford a proper doctor. That was before he joined the Royal Guard, before his steady salary lifted his family from poverty. The next morning, Thomas reported for duty as usual. The captain of the guard called him aside, asking about yesterday's walk with Princess Eleanor. Thomas felt his heart race. Had someone witnessed the bakery incident and reported it? He prepared himself to tell the truth, to accept whatever punishment came, but the captain only wanted to know if there had been any security concerns. Thomas replied that the princess's walk had been peaceful and uneventful. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, yet he felt strangely certain it was the right thing to do. The captain nodded, satisfied, and dismissed him. Days passed. Thomas continued his duties, but something had fundamentally changed inside him. He began noticing things he had ignored before. The way palace servants flinched when nobles passed. The fear in commoners' eyes when guards approached. The vast gap between those who ruled and those who served. Princess Eleanor, meanwhile, spent her days in deep thought. She attended royal meetings but contributed little. Her father, the king, noticed her distraction and asked if something troubled her. Eleanor assured him she was fine, simply tired from her studies. She could not explain the weight that now pressed on her heart. One afternoon, Eleanor summoned Thomas to her private study. He entered nervously, unsure what to expect. The princess was sitting by the window, looking out at the city below. She did not turn when he entered, just asked him to sit. This breach of formal protocol surprised him. Eleanor spoke about the bakery incident. She said she could not stop thinking about Margaret's words. The princess admitted that she had been naive to think a simple cloak could help her understand common people's lives. She said she felt like she was living in a beautiful cage, surrounded by luxury while ignorant of real suffering. Thomas listened without interrupting. Eleanor then asked him something that shocked him. She wanted to know about his life before joining the Royal Guard. She asked if he had ever been hungry, truly hungry. She questioned whether he had ever felt helpless against circumstances beyond his control. For the first time, Thomas spoke honestly to royalty about his past. He told her about growing up in a small village, about his sister's death, about watching his mother cry because she could not feed her children. He described the desperation that drove him to join the army at 14, lying about his age to get the steady meals that came with military service. Eleanor cried as he spoke. Thomas had never seen royalty show such genuine emotion. She apologized, though he did not understand why. She said she was sorry that the kingdom she would one day help rule had failed families like his. She promised she would try to do better, to be better. Thomas felt something crack inside him. All his years of rigid military discipline, of following orders without question, of maintaining emotional distance from those he served, suddenly it all seemed hollow. Here was a princess who cared more about a common baker's pain than her own insulted dignity. Here was royalty willing to listen to a guard's tragic past without judgment. They talked for hours that afternoon. Eleanor asked Thomas endless questions about life outside the palace walls. She wanted to know everything. How much did bread really cost? How did families survive when the harvest was poor? What did people truly think about the royal family? Thomas answered as honestly as he dared. He told her that most common people respected the royal family, but felt distant from them. He explained that many were too worried about their daily survival to care much about palace politics. He admitted that some were bitter, seeing the royalty as symbols of a system that kept them poor. Eleanor listened to every word, taking mental notes. She told Thomas that she wanted to make changes, but she felt powerless. Her father was traditional, believing that royalty should remain separate from common people. Her advisors were all nobles who had never known hardship. She felt alone in her desire for reform. Thomas surprised himself by offering support. He told the princess that she was not alone. He said that there were others in the palace, servants and lower-ranking guards who shared her concerns. They simply had no voice, no power to speak up. Eleanor's eyes lit up with hope and determination. As Thomas left the study that evening, he realized that his life had taken an unexpected turn. He was no longer just a guard following orders. He had become something more complicated. An ally, a confidant, perhaps even a friend to someone who should have been forever beyond his reach. That night, Thomas made a decision. He would help Princess Eleanor however he could. If she truly wanted to understand and help common people, he would be her guide. He would show her the reality beyond palace walls, the struggles and hopes of ordinary citizens. But he also knew this path was dangerous. Helping royalty break protocol, encouraging a princess to question the established order, these actions could be seen as treasonous. If discovered, he could lose everything. His position, his honor, possibly even his life. Yet as Thomas lay in his bunk that night staring at the dark ceiling, he felt more alive than he had in years. For once, he was not just following orders. He was choosing to do what felt right, even if it meant risking everything he had worked so hard to achieve. In her chambers, Eleanor also could not sleep. She thought about Margaret, wondering if the woman still struggled. She thought about all the other Margarets in the kingdom, facing hardships while royalty lived in comfort. She made a silent vow to herself. She would find a way to bridge the gap between palace and people. The encounter at the bakery had changed 3 lives. Margaret, though she did not know it yet, would soon receive help from an unexpected source. Eleanor had found her purpose, a mission that would define her future reign. And Thomas had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage is not in following orders, but in choosing compassion over duty. The seeds of change had been planted. Now they would begin to grow, slowly at first, but with the potential to transform an entire kingdom, all because one woman spoke harsh truths, one princess chose humility over pride, and one guard decided that mercy mattered more than rigid rules. 3 days after their conversation, Eleanor summoned Thomas again. This time she had a plan and she needed his help to execute it. The princess had been thinking constantly about Margaret and decided she could not simply forget the struggling baker. She wanted to help, but not in a way that revealed her identity or felt like charity from above. Eleanor explained her idea to Thomas. She wanted to visit the bakery again, this time dressed as a common woman, and truly talk with Margaret. She wanted to understand what had caused such bitterness, what struggles the baker faced daily. Thomas immediately saw the risks. If anyone discovered a princess wandering the city in disguise, the scandal would be enormous. But Eleanor was determined. She told Thomas that she could not rule people she did not understand. She could not make good decisions from inside a palace, surrounded only by nobles who had never known hardship. Thomas saw the fire in her eyes and knew no argument would change her mind. So he agreed to help on the condition that he could ensure her safety. They planned carefully. Eleanor would wear simple servant's clothes, nothing that would attract attention. Thomas would accompany her dressed as a common worker, close enough to protect her but far enough to not interfere with her conversations. They would go during the busy market hours when many people were around, making them less noticeable. The following morning, they set out before dawn. Eleanor wore a plain brown dress she had borrowed from a chambermaid. Her hair was tied back in a simple style, her face free of any cosmetics. Thomas wore rough worker's clothes, a worn cap covering his distinctive military haircut. They looked like any other working people heading to the market. The city looked different at this hour. Workers hurried to their jobs, vendors set up their stalls, children ran errands for their parents. Eleanor watched everything with wide eyes, absorbing details she had never noticed from her carriage windows. The smell of the streets, the sound of merchants calling out their wares, the tired faces of people beginning another hard day. They reached the bakery just as Margaret was opening. The woman looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting many sleepless nights. Eleanor took a deep breath and entered alone while Thomas waited outside, pretending to examine goods at a nearby stall. Margaret looked up from arranging bread loaves. She did not recognize Eleanor in her simple clothes with her different hairstyle. The baker greeted her with the same tired, somewhat harsh tone she used with most customers. Eleanor asked for bread, keeping her voice quiet and humble. As Margaret wrapped the purchase, Eleanor gathered her courage. She mentioned that she had been in the bakery a few days earlier and had witnessed the baker's angry words to another customer. She asked if Margaret often felt such frustration. The question was gentle, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Margaret's hands paused in their work. She looked at Eleanor suspiciously, wondering if this was some kind of trap, but something in the younger woman's eyes seemed sincere. Margaret's defenses lowered slightly. She admitted that yes, she was often frustrated. Life had been cruel, and sometimes that cruelty spilled out in her words. Eleanor asked if she could sit for a moment. Margaret hesitated but then nodded toward a small bench near the window. For the next hour, the two women talked. Margaret told her story about her husband leaving, about her sick daughter, about the constant struggle to keep the bakery running while paying rent and buying medicine. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her heart breaking with every detail. She learned that Margaret's daughter, Anna, was 8 years old and suffered from a lung condition that required expensive treatments. The doctor had said Anna needed better nutrition and possibly a change of climate. But such luxuries were impossible dreams for a struggling baker. Margaret talked about how hard she worked, starting before dawn and ending long after dark. She described the fear that haunted her every night, the terror of losing her bakery or watching her daughter's condition worsen. She admitted that her anger at the well-dressed woman days earlier had not really been about that person at all. It was rage at a world that seemed designed to crush people like her. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and gently touched Margaret's work-worn hand. She said she understood now, that she was sorry for whatever the well-dressed woman had done to seem insensitive. Margaret looked at her in surprise. This common girl seemed to have an unusual way of speaking, a gentleness that was rare in the harsh world of daily survival. The baker's expression softened. She thanked Eleanor for listening. Margaret admitted that she could not remember the last time someone had simply sat with her and cared about her troubles. Most people were too busy with their own problems. Her friends had drifted away over the years, unable to help and tired of her constant struggles. Eleanor asked careful questions. How much was the rent? How expensive was Anna's medicine? What would it take to give Margaret some relief from her constant worry? She framed these questions as simple curiosity, as if she were just an interested listener rather than someone planning to help. Margaret answered honestly, too worn down to be suspicious. She mentioned specific amounts, described her debts, talked about the small dreams she had given up. Eleanor memorized every detail, her mind already working on solutions. But she knew she had to be careful. If she simply gave money, Margaret might refuse it or become suspicious about where it came from. After their conversation, Eleanor purchased more bread than she could carry. Margaret protested, saying it was too much, but Eleanor insisted. She said she was buying for several neighbors. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor asked if she could visit again sometime. She said she enjoyed their talk and would like to be friends. Margaret was surprised by this offer. She had not had a friend in years. Something about this young woman felt trustworthy and kind. She agreed, saying Eleanor was welcome any time. As Eleanor left, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in a long time. A small spark of hope. Outside, Thomas saw Eleanor emerge from the bakery with tears streaming down her face. He moved toward her immediately, concerned. Eleanor shook her head, indicating she was all right. They walked several streets away before she finally broke down, leaning against a building wall as sobs shook her body. Thomas stood guard, giving her privacy while ensuring her safety. When Eleanor finally composed herself, she told him everything Margaret had shared. She described little Anna's illness, the impossible debts, the crushing weight of daily survival. Thomas listened, his own jaw tight with emotion. He had seen such struggles in his own family, knew too well how poverty could destroy lives. Eleanor declared that she had to help Margaret, but it had to be done carefully. She could not simply give money as a princess. That would be degrading, would make Margaret feel like a beggar receiving charity from someone who had everything. Eleanor wanted to help in a way that preserved Margaret's dignity and independence. Thomas had an idea. What if they found a way to increase the bakery's business? What if wealthier customers started coming to Margaret's shop, drawn by rumors of the best bread in the city? The increased income would help Margaret without her knowing it came from royal intervention. Eleanor loved this idea but wanted to do more. She decided to use her position to arrange for a palace doctor to offer free services to children in Margaret's neighborhood, under the guise of a new public health initiative. Anna would benefit without anyone knowing the princess had specially arranged it for her. Over the following days, Eleanor and Thomas put their plans into motion. Thomas quietly spread word among palace servants about a wonderful little bakery with the finest bread. Eleanor convinced the royal physician to start a charitable program for sick children in poor neighborhoods, framing it as good for the kingdom's image. Meanwhile, Eleanor visited the bakery twice more, always in disguise. Each time, she and Margaret talked for hours. A genuine friendship formed between them. Margaret opened up about her fears and dreams, while Eleanor shared carefully edited versions of her own life, presenting herself as a servant in a wealthy household. Margaret began to look forward to these visits. This young woman brought light into her dark days. Eleanor's questions made Margaret think about possibilities she had long ago abandoned. What if things could get better? What if Anna could recover? What if life held more than just endless struggle? One afternoon, Margaret mentioned something that surprised Eleanor. She said that ever since the encounter with that well-dressed woman weeks earlier, things had started changing. More customers were coming to the bakery. Someone had left extra coins on the counter twice. A doctor had visited and offered to treat Anna for free as part of some new program. Margaret wondered aloud if these were coincidences, or if somehow her harsh words to that woman had set something in motion. She felt guilty about her behavior that day, wished she could apologize. Eleanor, fighting back tears, assured her that the woman probably understood and held no grudge. That evening, Eleanor returned to the palace feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She was making a real difference in someone's life, not through grand proclamations or royal decrees, but through genuine connection and careful, dignified assistance. Thomas watched her happiness and felt his own sense of purpose deepening. But both of them knew their secret missions could nay. Weeks passed, and the friendship between Eleanor and Margaret deepened. The baker's daughter Anna was improving thanks to the free medical care from the royal physician. The bakery's business had grown steadily, bringing in enough money for Margaret to finally catch up on her debts. The constant fear that had lived in Margaret's chest for years began to ease. But with these improvements came new complications. Margaret kept wondering about the source of her good fortune. She was not naive. Too many good things were happening too quickly. The timing seemed connected to that encounter weeks ago with the well-dressed woman she had insulted. And her new friend, the one who dressed as a servant, sometimes used words and phrases that seemed too refined for someone of common birth. One afternoon, as Eleanor visited the bakery in her disguise, Margaret confronted her. The baker's voice was gentle but firm. She asked Eleanor directly who she really was. She said she was grateful for their friendship, but could not shake the feeling that Eleanor was hiding something important. Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat. She had grown to genuinely care for Margaret and did not want to lose this friendship. But she also could not keep lying. Thomas, who was outside as usual, noticed Eleanor's distressed expression through the window. He moved closer to the door, ready to intervene if needed. After a long silence, Eleanor made a decision. She asked Margaret to close the bakery early and talk privately upstairs where Margaret and Anna lived. Margaret agreed, her expression curious and slightly worried. She locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and led Eleanor up the narrow stairs. The small apartment above the bakery was humble but clean. Anna sat by the window, reading a book the palace doctor had given her. The child looked healthier than she had weeks ago, color returning to her cheeks. She smiled at Eleanor, whom she had met during previous visits. Margaret sent Anna to play in her room, then sat across from Eleanor at the small kitchen table. Eleanor took a deep breath. She knew this moment would change everything. She could continue lying, make up some story to explain away Margaret's suspicions, or she could trust this woman with the truth. Eleanor chose truth. She began by apologizing for the deception. Then slowly, carefully, she revealed her real identity. She explained that she was the woman Margaret had insulted that day in the bakery. She was Princess Eleanor, daughter of King Richard, heir to the throne. Margaret's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally something that looked like betrayal. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. She accused Eleanor of playing games with her, of treating her life like some kind of entertainment for bored royalty. Eleanor remained seated, tears streaming down her face. She explained that it had never been a game. She told Margaret about how those harsh words in the bakery had shaken her, forced her to confront her own ignorance about how her subjects truly lived. She described the conversations with Thomas, the careful planning to help without condescending, the genuine friendship she had found. Margaret paced the small kitchen, her hands shaking. She thought about all the things she had said to Eleanor during their talks. Complaints about the royal family, criticisms of the kingdom's policies, personal struggles she would never have shared if she had known she was talking to a princess. The humiliation felt crushing, but then Margaret remembered something else. She thought about Eleanor's tears during their conversations, the genuine emotion in the young woman's eyes when hearing about Anna's illness, the careful questions that showed real interest rather than mere curiosity. The quiet ways help had arrived without fanfare or demands for gratitude. Margaret sat down slowly. She asked Eleanor why. Why risk scandal by wandering the city in disguise? Why care about one bitter baker and her sick child? Why not simply move on after being insulted and forget the whole incident? Eleanor answered with complete honesty. She said she had been living in a beautiful prison, seeing only what others wanted her to see. Margaret's harsh words had been like a hammer breaking through glass, letting reality rush in. Eleanor explained that she could not rule people she did not understand, could not make good decisions from inside a palace bubble. She told Margaret about her dreams for the kingdom. She wanted to change laws that kept people trapped in poverty. She hoped to create programs that helped families like Margaret's, not as charity but as the kingdom's responsibility to its citizens. But she could not do any of that without truly understanding what people needed. Margaret listened, her anger slowly transforming into something else. She asked about the medical care for Anna, the increased bakery business, all the small miracles that had happened. Eleanor admitted her role in arranging these things, but emphasized that she had tried to do it in ways that preserved Margaret's dignity and independence. The baker was quiet for a long time. Eleanor waited, holding her breath, afraid she had lost a friendship that had come to mean more to her than Margaret probably realized. Finally, Margaret spoke. She said she should probably be angry, should feel manipulated, but somehow she did not. Instead, she felt something unexpected. She felt seen. Margaret explained that in all her years of struggle, no one with power had ever cared enough to truly understand her life. Noble ladies sometimes gave coins to beggars. Churches offered soup to the poor, but it was all done from a distance. No one had ever sat with her as an equal, listened to her stories, cried with her over her pain. Eleanor asked if Margaret could forgive the deception. Margaret thought about it seriously. Then she said there was nothing to forgive. Eleanor had done more for her and Anna in a few weeks than anyone had in years. The methods might have been unconventional, but the care was real. That mattered more than royal protocols or proper procedures. Relief flooded through Eleanor. But Margaret had a condition. She said if they were to continue being friends, it had to be with complete honesty from now on. No more disguises, no more pretending. Eleanor agreed immediately. She asked if she could visit as herself, as Princess Eleanor, not as a servant girl playing dress-up. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. She said that might be difficult to explain to the neighbors. A princess regularly visiting a simple baker's apartment would cause gossip and speculation. But she had an idea. What if Eleanor hired her to occasionally provide baked goods for small palace functions? That would give them a legitimate reason to meet and talk. Eleanor loved this idea. It would help Margaret's business while providing cover for their friendship. She went further, suggesting that Margaret could become an advisor of sorts, helping Eleanor understand the real needs and concerns of common people. Margaret was skeptical about this but agreed to try. Thomas, who had been waiting outside with increasing worry, was relieved when Eleanor finally emerged. He could tell from her face that something significant had happened. Eleanor quickly explained that Margaret now knew the truth. Thomas felt his stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of complication he had feared, but Eleanor assured him it was all right. Margaret understood and had even agreed to help Eleanor in her mission to reform the kingdom. Thomas was skeptical but willing to trust Eleanor's judgment. Over the following days, he met with Margaret several times, initially to assess whether she posed a security risk. What Thomas found surprised him. Margaret was intelligent, practical, and fiercely loyal to those she cared about. She had no interest in using Eleanor's friendship for personal gain, beyond the honest business relationship they had established. She wanted Anna to grow up in a better kingdom, and if helping Eleanor could make that happen, she would do it. The three of them formed an unlikely alliance. Eleanor provided resources and authority. Thomas offered protection and practical knowledge of how palace systems worked. Margaret contributed real understanding of common people's lives and needs. Together, they began planning ways to create meaningful change, but they all knew their efforts would face obstacles. The king and his traditional advisors would resist reforms that shifted power or resources. Other nobles might see Eleanor's common friendships as beneath her dignity, and there were always those who profited from keeping things exactly as they were. One evening, as Eleanor prepared to leave Margaret's apartment after a long discussion about grain prices and their impact on poor families, Margaret asked her something important. She wanted to know what had made Eleanor different from other royals. Why did she care when others did not? Eleanor thought carefully before answering. She said she did not know if she was truly different, or if she had just been fortunate enough to have her eyes opened. She believed that if other royals spent time really knowing their subjects, seeing their struggles firsthand, many would want to help. The problem was the walls between classes, the isolation of privilege. Margaret nodded, understanding. She told Eleanor that her friendship, strange as it was, had changed her too. She no longer saw all wealthy or powerful people as enemies. She recognized that individuals could transcend their circumstances and truly care about others. This realization had softened some of the bitterness that had lived in her heart for so long. As Eleanor walked back toward the palace with Thomas at her side, she felt both hopeful and anxious. They had crossed an important threshold. The partnership between Eleanor, Thomas, and Margaret grew stronger over the following months. Margaret began supplying bread and pastries for small palace gatherings, giving her legitimate reasons to visit. During these visits, she and Eleanor would steal private moments to discuss ideas for helping struggling citizens. Eleanor started implementing small changes. She convinced her father to reduce taxes on basic goods like bread and milk. She established a fund to help sick children receive medical care, inspired by Anna's recovery. She pushed for better wages for palace servants, arguing that a prosperous kingdom needed prosperous people at every level. The king was puzzled by his daughter's sudden interest in economic policies and common welfare. He attributed it to youthful idealism and assumed she would outgrow it. But some of the older advisors grew suspicious. They noticed the princess spending unusual amounts of time with a common baker. They whispered among themselves about the impropriety of such associations. Lord Blackwood, the king's chief advisor, was particularly troubled. He was a traditional man who believed firmly in maintaining social hierarchies. The idea of royalty befriending commoners offended his sense of proper order. He began quietly investigating Margaret, looking for any scandalous information he could use to end this inappropriate friendship. Margaret sensed the growing scrutiny. She noticed palace guards watching her bakery, saw how certain nobles looked at her with suspicion when she delivered goods to the palace. She worried that her friendship with Eleanor was putting the princess at risk. She considered ending their relationship to protect Eleanor's reputation. When Margaret expressed these concerns, Eleanor refused to even consider it. She said Margaret's friendship and guidance were too valuable to sacrifice for the comfort of narrow-minded nobles. Thomas, however, shared Margaret's worries. He had heard the whispers, knew that powerful people were watching them all carefully. The situation came to a crisis one autumn afternoon. Eleanor was visiting Margaret's apartment, discussing plans for a new program to help widows and orphans. They were so engrossed in conversation that neither noticed the time passing. Eleanor had stayed far longer than planned, and darkness was falling. Thomas, waiting outside, grew increasingly nervous. He knew the king expected Eleanor at a formal dinner that evening. She was now going to be late, and her absence would be noticed. He sent a message to the palace claiming the princess had been delayed helping with an injured servant, buying them some time. But Lord Blackwood had been having Eleanor followed. His spy reported that the princess was not with an injured servant, but was instead in the apartment above a common bakery, seemingly without proper escort. Blackwood saw his opportunity. The advisor went directly to the king with his information. He painted a picture of a princess consorting inappropriately with commoners, neglecting her royal duties and bringing shame to the crown. He suggested that this baker woman had some kind of undue influence over Eleanor, possibly even manipulating her for personal gain. The king was initially dismissive, but Blackwood was persistent. He provided details about Eleanor's recent policy suggestions, noting how many of them seemed to benefit the lower classes at the expense of noble privileges. He implied that the baker was using Eleanor to push radical changes that would upset the kingdom's traditional order. Alarmed, the king sent guards to fetch Eleanor immediately. They arrived at Margaret's bakery with stern faces and sharp orders. Thomas tried to delay them to give Eleanor time to prepare, but they pushed past him. They climbed the stairs and demanded entry to Margaret's apartment. Eleanor emerged, her face pale but composed. She ordered the guards to wait outside while she said goodbye to her friend. The guards, uncomfortable with the entire situation, reluctantly agreed. Eleanor quickly told Margaret that trouble was coming, that their friendship might cost them both dearly. She urged Margaret to say nothing about their plans and promised to protect her however possible. Margaret grabbed Eleanor's hands, her eyes filled with tears. She told Eleanor not to sacrifice her position or future for a simple baker. But Eleanor squeezed back, saying that Margaret was not simple and their friendship was worth fighting for. Then she left with the guards, her head held high despite the shame they were trying to project onto her. At the palace, Eleanor faced her father's anger. The king demanded to know why she had been spending so much time with a common baker. He wanted to understand what could possibly be important enough to neglect her royal duties. Behind him, Lord Blackwood watched with satisfaction, confident he had ended this inappropriate association. Eleanor made a choice in that moment. She could lie, make up some excuse, distance herself from Margaret to appease her father and his advisors, or she could stand firm and fight for what she believed was right. She chose to fight. The princess explained to her father that Margaret was not just a baker but a teacher. Through their friendship, Eleanor had learned more about their kingdom's real problems than years of formal education had taught her. She described the struggles of common people, the failures of current policies, the desperate need for reform. The king listened with growing discomfort. He had never heard his daughter speak with such passion and conviction. Eleanor went further, detailing the specific changes she wanted to make and why they were necessary. She challenged her father to truly see his kingdom, not just the wealthy parts but the struggling neighborhoods he had never visited. Lord Blackwood interrupted, warning that the princess was being influenced by radical ideas from unsuitable companions. He suggested that Margaret should be investigated, possibly even arrested for corrupting royalty. Eleanor turned on him with fury, stating that the only corruption was in a system that allowed children to starve while nobles feasted. The confrontation grew heated. Other advisors were called in. Some supported Blackwood's traditionalist view, while a few younger ones were intrigued by Eleanor's arguments. The king sat in his throne, caught between his daughter's passionate idealism and his advisors' warnings about maintaining order. Finally, the king made a decision. He would not forbid Eleanor from seeing Margaret, but he demanded that all future meetings happen within palace grounds under proper supervision. He also insisted that Eleanor focus more on traditional royal duties and less on radical reform ideas. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. Eleanor accepted her father's terms, knowing she had no choice. But she also knew this was far from over. Blackwood and others would continue trying to end her friendship with Margaret and block any meaningful reforms. She would need to be smarter, more careful, and more strategic. That night, Thomas found Eleanor in the palace gardens, staring at the city lights below. She was crying, something he rarely saw. She told him that she felt like she was failing. Every attempt to help people faced obstacles from those who benefited from keeping things unchanged. Thomas sat beside her, a breach of protocol he no longer cared about. He reminded her of how much she had already accomplished. Anna was healthy. Margaret's bakery was thriving. Several new programs were helping people. Small changes were adding up, even if they felt insufficient. Eleanor appreciated his words, but said it was not enough. As long as fundamental systems remained unjust, individual acts of kindness were just bandages on deep wounds. She needed to think bigger, plan more carefully. She could not let people like Blackwood win. Meanwhile, at her bakery, Margaret also cried. Anna, now 9 and much healthier, asked why her mother was sad. Margaret tried to explain that sometimes doing the right thing came with a price. She worried that her friendship with Eleanor had caused the princess serious trouble. But Anna, wise beyond her years, said something that surprised Margaret. The child told her mother that Princess Eleanor was brave for being friends with them even when others said it was wrong. Anna said she wanted to be like Eleanor when she grew up, someone who cared about others regardless of what society said was proper. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. Anna's words reminded her why Eleanor's mission mattered. They were not just trying to help a few individuals, but working to create a kingdom where all children, regardless of their birth, could have opportunities to thrive. The next morning, Eleanor sent a carefully worded letter to Margaret. She explained the king's new restrictions, but assured Margaret their work would continue. They just needed to be more strategic. Eleanor suggested they communicate through Thomas and carefully planned palace visits. Margaret replied with her own letter, expressing gratitude and determination. She also shared Anna's words about Eleanor's bravery. Eleanor cried when she read them, but this time they were tears of renewed purpose rather than despair. Thomas became the crucial link between them. He carried messages, arranged discreet meetings, and helped coordinate their efforts. His role had evolved from simple bodyguard to active participant in their mission. He found this new purpose deeply satisfying, even as it grew increasingly dangerous. Lord Blackwood had not given up. He continued investigating, looking for any scandal or impropriety he could use to discredit Eleanor and end her reform efforts. He had spies watching Thomas, Margaret, and even Eleanor herself. He was patient, willing to wait for the right moment to strike. The tension in the palace grew. Eleanor navigated her days carefully, balancing rar. Winter arrived, bringing with it a harsh cold that particularly hurt the poor. Eleanor watched from palace windows as snow covered the city, knowing that for many families winter meant choosing between heating and food. Her frustration with the slow pace of change had reached a breaking point. Lord Blackwood, meanwhile, had finally found what he believed was his winning move. His spies discovered that Thomas had been secretly meeting with groups of common people, apparently organizing them on Eleanor's behalf. Blackwood framed this as a dangerous conspiracy, suggesting the princess was inciting unrest among the lower classes. The advisor presented his evidence to the king during a private council meeting. He painted a picture of a princess being manipulated by commoners into undermining royal authority. He demanded that Thomas be arrested and questioned, that Margaret be banned from palace grounds, and that Eleanor be confined to the palace until she abandoned her radical ideas. The king was deeply troubled. He loved his daughter, but worried about the kingdom's stability. He had seen other kingdoms torn apart by conflicts between classes. Blackwood's warnings about unrest and rebellion frightened him. He agreed to confront Eleanor once more, this time with the full council present. Eleanor was summoned to the throne room. She entered to find her father surrounded by advisors, their faces mostly stern and disapproving. Only a few younger counselors looked sympathetic. Blackwood stood to the side, barely concealing his satisfaction. Eleanor knew this was a critical moment. The king presented Blackwood's evidence and accusations. He spoke sorrowfully about being disappointed in his daughter. He said he understood her desire to help people, but that she was going about it the wrong way, creating division and instability. He asked her to explain herself before the council. Eleanor stood silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak, not as a defensive daughter, but as a future queen presenting her vision. She acknowledged meeting with common people and organizing them, but not for rebellion. She was teaching them about their rights, encouraging peaceful advocacy for fair treatment. She challenged each council member directly. She asked them when they had last spoken with a common citizen about their struggles. She questioned how they could make good policies for people whose lives they had never tried to understand. She pointed out that the kingdom's wealth came from common workers, yet those workers received almost none of its benefits. Eleanor then did something unexpected. She called Thomas into the room. The guard entered, knowing his career and possibly his freedom were at risk. Eleanor asked him to tell the council about his life before joining the royal guard, about his sister who died from poverty, about families he knew who still struggled. Thomas spoke with quiet dignity. He described realities that made several council members visibly uncomfortable. He talked about children going hungry, about sick people dying because they could not afford doctors, about the quiet desperation that lived in so many homes. He said he had sworn to protect the kingdom, and he believed that meant protecting all its people, not just the wealthy. Then Eleanor called for Margaret. The baker had been waiting in an anteroom, terrified but determined. She entered the throne room, a space where someone like her would normally never be allowed. She curtsied clumsily, her work-worn hands trembling. Eleanor asked Margaret to tell the council her story. Margaret spoke haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She described her struggles, her anger at a system that seemed designed to crush people like her. She admitted to the harsh words she had spoken to Eleanor months ago and explained what had driven that anger. But Margaret also spoke about transformation. She described how Eleanor's genuine care had changed her, how seeing royalty truly try to understand common people had softened her bitterness. She said Eleanor was not trying to cause rebellion but to prevent it by addressing injustices before they exploded into violence. The throne room was silent when Margaret finished. Some advisors looked moved, others remained skeptical. Lord Blackwood stood to speak, ready to dismiss these testimonies as emotional manipulation. But before he could, the king raised his hand for silence. The king stood from his throne and walked down to stand directly before Eleanor. For a long moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other. Then the king did something that shocked everyone present. He embraced Eleanor, tears in his eyes. The king said he had been blind. He admitted that surrounding himself only with nobles had isolated him from the kingdom's reality. He confessed that he had been afraid of change, worried that reform would lead to chaos. But listening to Thomas and Margaret, seeing Eleanor's passion and wisdom, he realized that refusing to change was the real danger. Lord Blackwood protested loudly. He warned that this was a mistake, that showing weakness would encourage rebellion. Other traditional advisors joined his objections. But several younger council members spoke up in support of Eleanor. They said her approach offered a path forward, a way to address problems before they became crises. The king made his decision. He would support Eleanor's reform efforts, but they would proceed carefully and gradually. He appointed Eleanor to lead a new council specifically focused on improving conditions for common people. He insisted that this council include voices from all classes, not just nobility. Blackwood and several other traditional advisors resigned in protest. They could not accept this shift in policy. The king let them go, understanding that some would never embrace change. He replaced them with younger, more progressive counselors who shared Eleanor's vision. The transformation did not happen overnight. Implementing real reforms took years of hard work. Eleanor faced continued opposition from traditionalists and skepticism from common people who had learned not to trust promises from authority. But she persisted, guided by Margaret's practical wisdom and Thomas's understanding of how systems worked. Margaret's bakery became a community center of sorts, a place where common people could meet and discuss their concerns. Eleanor visited regularly, no longer in disguise but openly as herself. These visits initially caused gossip, but gradually people came to accept and even admire their princess who cared enough to listen. Anna grew up watching her mother and the princess work together. The young girl developed a passion for justice and equality. Years later, she would become a teacher, helping to educate children from poor families, continuing the work Eleanor and Margaret had started. Thomas rose through the ranks, eventually becoming captain of the guard. But more importantly, he became Eleanor's most trusted advisor on security matters. He helped her understand how to implement changes without triggering the violence everyone feared. His loyalty to Eleanor never wavered, grounded in shared values rather than mere duty. The kingdom slowly transformed. New laws protected workers' rights. Programs ensured all children could receive education and medical care, regardless of their family's wealth. Taxes were restructured to be more equitable. These changes faced constant challenges, but the foundation Eleanor established proved strong enough to endure. When the old king died years later, Eleanor became queen. Her coronation was unlike any before. Alongside the traditional nobles, common people filled the ceremony hall. Margaret and Anna sat in places of honor, their presence symbolizing the new kingdom Eleanor had worked to create. In her first speech as queen, Eleanor told the story of a bitter baker who had insulted her in a marketplace. She described how those harsh words had shattered her comfortable ignorance and started her on a journey of real understanding. She thanked Margaret publicly for that gift of truth, even though it had been delivered in anger. Margaret, now older and wiser, stood and responded. She spoke about how a princess had responded to insults not with punishment, but with humility and genuine desire to learn. She said that Eleanor's choice to listen rather than retaliate had changed not just her life but the entire kingdom's direction. The moment became legendary, repeated in stories and songs. The queen who had been insulted by a baker and chose friendship over vengeance. The bitter woman whose anger became a catalyst for justice. The guard who put conscience above orders. Together, they had proven that change was possible when people chose connection over division. Years passed. Eleanor ruled wisely, always remembering the lessons learned in a simple bakery. When faced with difficult decisions, she would often consult Margaret, whose practical wisdom had become invaluable. Their friendship, once scandalous, became celebrated as an example of how barriers between classes could be crossed. Thomas remained at Eleanor's side, her friend and protector until old age forced his retirement. He trained the next generation of guards to understand that protecting the kingdom meant serving all its people. His legacy lived on in soldiers who saw themselves as servants rather than oppressors. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren grow up in a kingdom very different from the one where she had struggled. Anna's children attended good schools, had access to health care, and faced opportunities Margaret could never have dreamed of in her youth. The baker died peacefully, surrounded by family, knowing her suffering had not been meaningless. Eleanor ruled for many years, implementing reforms that made her kingdom prosperous and more just. Other kingdoms began copying her innovations, seeing how equality